Andy Ngo is an editor-at-large at the Post Millennial. He is also the author of Unmasked, his own new book that is being released on February 2nd. It's inside Antifa's plan to destroy Western democracy. Andy is probably the #1 expert on Antifa, probably in the world. So if you're someone who's curious about why these riots were happening in 2020, why this violence was happening, why 6 blocks in Seattle were seized as sovereign territory of some new utopia, this is the guy to answer those questions. So with that said, please listen to my exclusive interview with Andy Ngo. This is Cancel This, and I'm Angelo Sidoro. Enjoy. All right, Andy, thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So I've been following you for a long time, and you are basically, at least to me, the #1 expert probably in the world when it comes to Antifa. So it's really interesting now that you're coming out with this new book, Unmasked. What made you put pen to paper to work on something like this?
I saw that there's a lot of misinformation out in the public about Antifa, and a lot of that has been through the poor work of other colleagues in this journalism industry. And a lot of it is also obfuscation from politicians as well. And I think I normally do written reports. I could point people to various reports for information, but I think the public needs something that's more available in like one entity for them to get as much information as possible, and also written in a way that would be people could easily understand and follow along. So that was the background for why I started, and the motivation to continue to do it, of course, was when all of us across the United States and parts of the world realized that we weren't dealing with a ragtag group of fringe radicals, street hooligans, but rather a unopposed militant militia, violent extremist networks of groups, essentially, who are able to carry out mass riots and sustain the riots, actually, and get their own sources of funding really in front of our eyes, and to weaken and destabilize local jurisdictions.
Yeah, well, you raise a good point with having one good source for this because, I mean, with everything that happened this past summer and the entire year of 2020, I've had a lot of people, even some of our TPM readers, say, you know what, I love everything everyone does, but I don't have, 10 hours to go through all the research and look into everything. I wish there was one compact source, and I really think Unmasked is that. I'm about halfway through the press version, and I like that you go even into the history of Antifa. At first glance, a lot of people will say Antifa, well, that means anti-fascist. Why would you oppose something that is anti-fascist? But of course, as you explained, this is not exactly what it is. Didn't Antifa start in, I believe, Germany? Is that correct?
The original Antifa, capital A, was a paramilitary group of the German Communist Party in the interwar years. So from its origins, it's always placed itself in opposition to liberal democracy, free markets, free speech. And during the interwar years, it wasn't actually the Nazis that the Antifa were fighting the most. They were fighting the Social Democrats, which was the party that was the ruling governing party in the Weimar Republic at that time. So the Antifa at that time were doing very similar things to what the Antifa today are doing, engaging in street brawls, attacking people for their different political views, destabilizing the government, polarizing people, leading people to turn to extremist politics. And this is like sort of the subtext of my warnings about Antifa is like, we aren't only needing to worry about their acts of terrorism in the US and elsewhere, but actually that they are creating the things that they say they are opposing. in that I do think that there is a reactionary movement on the far right that sees that Antifa can carry out acts of wanton, indiscriminate violence and feeling themselves that they need to organize in a similar manner to oppose because the state has been unable or unwilling to stop them. So we're dealing with very dangerous times right now, and I think I'm speaking to you just days after what happened in Capitol Hill, and so I think that reemphasizes the urgency for us to address political violence, particularly um, as a system in reactions and counter reactions, and all of this focus just on the far right in since 2016 because of Trump has really allowed this extremist movement on the left to grow and become embedded completely unchallenged.
Yeah, certainly emboldened. You raise a really good point, which is that when one side uses violence, eventually the other side is going to use violence, and neither side is good for using violence. You're just pointing out that this is a race to the bottom, and very unbecoming of Western society. So it's very troubling. But I think a question that a layman would have when looking at all this, when looking at these riots, when looking at these people who are wearing these masks, is what is going on there? I mean, what is it that compels someone to put on a mask, take a Molotov, break windows, attack people, kill people in some circumstances? I mean, you yourself were assaulted. What is it that motivates these people?
So, every good journalist is taught to remove yourself from the story because that's one way that you can help keep your biases in check. Obviously, journalists still will have biases. For me, there was a certain point where it's impossible to remove myself from the story because I was beaten by this movement that I cover. Beaten in the summer of 2019 led to a brain bleed, and I was hospitalized for that. And it took about a year of various therapies at a medical institution to address the deficiencies that I was dealing with cognitively in speech and balance and all that. So I think what people need to realize about Antifa is they're not just dangerous because of the street hooliganism, which, if there was a political will, can be stopped. But one, there's no political will. Two, there's also not a good understanding of what their ideology actually calls for. And that's what I hope the main thing that readers can take away from Unmasked is, like, in addition to learning about their acts of violence and terrorism and even homicides, is that they have an ideology that is coherent, uh, decades in the making, has a whole system of literature and booklets and pamphlets that are used to radicalize people. And their ideas have been actually mainstreamed in a very, very short amount of time. You just look in 2020 how within the papers of record in the United States, you look at those who are on broadcast media, the number of people who are supposed to be respectable commentators on the left who were sympathizing with the political violence, believing that property destruction and looting was all okay because it was for a good political cause. This is one of the most important tenets of Antifa's ideology. They don't think they're the bad guys. They think that when they're beating people with sticks, when they take Molotov cocktails and fire bombs and guns and explosives and knives and other weapons to riots, they actually think they're fighting for a noble cause. So I really work to deconstruct what they actually believe. And the ultimate end goal is the destruction of nation states, destruction of liberal democracy, destruction of the Enlightenment values that have built up civilizations that are prosperous and free and great to live in. They want to undo all of that. They believe that they can actually create a utopia free of government, free of property ownership, free of fascism, free of racism. So that you can think of it as like sort of a religious cult ideology, in that um, no matter what they do, it can never go too far, which is why they have taken steps to do abhorrent things like firebomb government facilities, take guns to in their attacks, shoot and kill people, and even with all the heinous things that they've done, unfortunately, they still come out on top in terms of the media narrative because they have so many allies in the mainstream left and in the mainstream media left as well that are willingly or unwillingly or ignorantly amplifying their messaging and their propaganda and their lies.
I think it is particularly horrifying when you refer to the media being complicit, because I remember these riots in the summer where you have a CNN reporter saying it's fiery but mostly peaceful, and you can see a building ablaze in the background, and you realize just how much this is sugarcoated. The same thing with officials, where the mayor of Seattle said it was a love fest in the Chaz, um, but there was murder. And I think it's particularly horrifying when, based on what you're saying, they fundamentally believe they're the good guys. So everything they do is completely justified. That's horrifying. And at least on a personal note, the way I became accustomed or introduced to Antifa was essentially mostly through inviting you to UBC, which that event ended up becoming canceled because Antifa threatened to burn the school down, basically. And the school canceled the event and emboldened people who have since then gotten people to lose their jobs, gotten people to leave town. This thing is exponential in the sense that it really motivates them to double down. And that cancellation, which it's been in the news before, but basically we're forced to go to the Supreme Court to decide, in Canada at least, whether a school can just give in to a group that wants to burn it down. What were your thoughts on that, at least on a personal note, when I guess we both sort of went through, me as an organizer, you as the speaker? Did that surprise you that it got to that point, or were you sort of used to Antifa by then?
No, none of this surprises me. And the reason why Antifa is in power is because we have those who are supposed to be the leaders and the adults in the room kowtowing and acquiescing to violent extremists on the left. And frequently, what makes Antifa and the far left in general so powerful in your country, Canada, as well as mine, the United States, is that they're in positions of power in academia, in journalism, in media, and entertainment, and all that. So they've created a system essentially where they protect one another in a way. They don't expunge one another for doing and saying extremist things. And now for a while, but now especially, they have big tech on their side as well. I think we should all shudder to see big tech mobilized not just to silence the sitting president of the United States, but actually to systematically remove its competitor, Parler, from existence, essentially. So, but going back just a little bit, you mentioned Chaz, which is the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. A lot of the viewers and listeners are from Canada. I just want to emphasize how surreal what happened in 2020 was, not just in Seattle, but also in Portland and other cities, in that people who were on the fringe far left actually claimed territory in major cities in the United States and claimed themselves sovereign and separate from the United States and not under jurisdiction of American legal law. And the elected officials who are supposed to uphold the Constitution, the rule of law, the laws of the city, the state, the county, they did nothing and actually encouraged it. So Seattle is the most egregious example where that autonomous zone, I was there and I write about it in the book, and you can read. It's not surprising that the city council and the mayor and all that were essentially praising these people who took over and terrorized a neighborhood. And it's very densely area. It's an area you can think of as densely packed as some parts of New York City. High risers, so lots of businesses, lots of condos, lots of flats and apartments all together, and they held six city blocks um, under their territory with actual hard borders and their own militias guarding these areas with weapons and keeping an eye on who was coming in and out. That's what actually happened. So seeing the mayor calling that it could be summer of love, seeing the Daily Beast describe this as just a really festive street party atmosphere. When at night you would hear screams, you would hear shootings, there were fights all over the place, and law enforcement did not go in. They actually stopped at the physical barriers. So you mentioned there was murder, there was several homicides. There were two people who died, one of who was only 16 years old. There were several shootings, and there was an attempted rape, so on and so forth. And eventually the mayor was forced to act. But then the people, Antifa, just kept returning to the same area to riot every week, the Capitol Hill neighborhood. In Portland, they also created an autonomous zone just last month in December. For 6 days, they claimed a residential area in the city and created a hard border with barricades, with actual booby traps. They actually laid spikes all over the street where if you stepped on it, you would get a nail or other sharp objects in your foot. You couldn't drive through. So, and this is an area where people lived with their families and they had to flee, and the city allowed them to do that. So, all the underlying conditions are still remaining. This whole, according to Antifa, they say they're just opposing the Trump administration, the fascist regime of Trump. That has always been a pretext from the beginning. And actually, if you look at what they're saying now, they're planning to organize openly riots for Inauguration Day because they don't accept the legitimacy of the U.S. government. So they reject Trump, they reject Joe Biden, they would reject every president, every elected official, because the stated goal is to destroy the U.S. in particular, because they view the U.S. as an imperialist, racist, white supremacist, fascist state. And the language they use today is really the same language that the communists used during the Cold War and how it described America and the West. I write a lot about the history of Antifa in the book because it's important to know that the Antifa ideology after World War II was institutionalized into the state ideology of East Germany, which was within the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. And they actually called the Berlin Wall the anti-fascist defense barrier. So they really viewed themselves as defending themselves from fascism of West Berlin, which is influenced by which was under the influence of the U.S. and its allies. So this is the enemy that we're dealing with, and nobody realizes it. Instead, they're being called anti-fascists who are opposing white supremacy. It's the same juvenile trick that fools everyone to think that Black Lives Matter is actually fighting for racial justice instead of systematically working to undermine the criminal justice system, free markets in the US, because according to the words of the founders and those who are in leadership positions in BLM, it's a communist Marxist movement.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned the Soviet Union. I think there's something tragically poetic with the Chaz and with these autonomous zones in the sense that they get their utopia, their sovereign project utopia, and it immediately turns into a violent dictatorship, similarly to anywhere else communism has been tried. So this all seems to congregate in the Pacific Northwest. We almost had an autonomous zone here in Vancouver, but everything you guys do, we do 50% worse. So we could never get it done. But I wanted to talk about Powell's, and I want to talk about, your book, drawing Antifa's attention for obvious reasons. They protested, I believe, a sort of historic bookstore in Portland, and they pulled your book. And ironically, of course, it backfired. It was a total Streisand effect. Your book is now #1 on Amazon. But tell me a little bit about that. What happened there? So they protested a bookstore?
They didn't just protest a bookstore, they surrounded it and actually threatened the customers who were coming in and out, and on several days forced the bookstore to close. And for the viewers who are not aware, Powell's Books is the biggest bookstore in Portland, and it's also sort of an institution in itself that it's a huge tourist spot because it's one of the largest bookstores in North America, if not the world. Um, there will be lots of visitors from British Columbia, from other states. They will go to Palace Books just because it's huge, and they have really they've always stood by um, this principle that we should sell. No book should be banned, and every year they actually dedicate time and week, a whole week, focusing on books that face some type of censorship or calls for censorship. So it was ironic and very sad that under the slightest pressure when it came to Antifa, that they folded and said that they would not stock my book on its shelves. And I'm based in Portland, and so they're not stocking a local writer on a very important topic. The city of Portland was under siege for more than 120 days of riots in 2020, and the riots are still happening. We've had 4 riots since New Year's Eve in Portland alone. So, but that wasn't good enough for Antifa. They didn't want that it was just not sold in physically in the stores. They wanted it actually banned completely from the online catalog. And because the bookstore wouldn't do that, what they've been doing is they've been harassing, intimidating the staff and customers outside the business. And unfortunately, yesterday, which was on the 6th day of the protests since it started, there was a riot right outside the flagship downtown location in the middle of a really busy street, West Burnside Street. So it's just this video that you can see on my Twitter and my YouTube of them just dressed in black. They have batons. They're like trying to beat up somebody in the street. It's just, but this has been Portland's Groundhog Day since last year, over and over and over. And fortunately, I'm really glad that other bookstores haven't given in to these harassment campaigns, and people can still pre-order the book. I think the tragedy of all the calls for my book to be banned is that we're weeks and weeks ahead out of release, as of this interview right now. So nobody has read it, and they, even without reading it, they want it banned.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's very telling, I think. And it's furthermore telling, and I want the listeners to understand that when they do these things, it's not like there's hundreds of thousands of Antifa, right? At the end of the day, your book is being sold. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are going to buy it and read it. And yet, a bookstore could be barred from selling it because 12 crazy people will not go away and will scream and yell and stomp their feet. That is the reality here, is that a very vocal and aggressive minority are controlling everything. So it's just shocking, but I'm glad to see that it is being sold. I see it's number one on Amazon, and that's just fantastic. Um, to end this on a more personal note, I wanted to ask you, and I've always wanted to ask you this question: what is it that truly inspires you to do the work you do, in the sense that you were assaulted, and many people, maybe myself included, after that event, if that happened to me, I would maybe say, you know what, not for me, and walk away from things. But you've doubled down as time goes on, even though your personal safety is at risk, even though you get accused of all these ridiculous labels. What is it on a personal level that makes you so dedicated to this cause of journalism, to this cause of exposing this? What is it that inspires you?
Because the ideas that have produced the civilization in the US, in Canada, in other liberal democratic states, these are societies that are worth defending. My family story is a story of refugees. My parents lived through a communist revolution in Vietnam, were sent to prison camp in the 70s, and fled by small boat until they found refuge at a UNHCR camp. And eventually it was the United States who took in my parents, my extended family, my relatives. Canada took in a lot of them, France. And so the story of the Vietnamese diaspora, we are refugees from people who were persecuted under the communist regime of Vietnam. And so to see the societies that we've settled in be under such, I would say, existential threat, because what the people who are opposing the United States, they're attacking like the fundamental ideas, and it's not just ideas that are unique to the U.S., but also form um, Canadian political culture, British political culture, society, the norms, right? All of that is like fundamentally under threat. I think when you mainstream and normalize the idea that you solve your political grievances through violence, that is how you undo society. And there's lots of societies in the world where that is how they solve issues. People form militias, they form their tribes, they kill one another, they carry out revenge killings. And like, I don't think people should be so arrogant to think that a country as powerful as the US is invincible. My confidence in the stability of the country was quite shaken in 2020, seeing what happened. I mean, literally, we had in major American metropolitan areas, the law enforcement could do nothing to respond to calls of people's businesses being set on fire, businesses, their properties and homes being looted. They couldn't respond. And this is like, so I guess it's very personal to me to see something so great be attacked. And so that's why I mean, Unmasked is a book about Antifa, but it's also a love letter to the U.S., a letter of gratitude that it settled my family, and it's also a letter, I think, to the wider West that settled my extended family. Yeah, I guess people who are listening to this just know that like we take for granted what we have. We take for granted the stabilities of what we're born into, and think that these norms and protections that we have will always be there, that nobody could fundamentally actually undo it. But it's arrogant to believe that there are organized wicked forces. And I say that as somebody who's not religious, but seeing these people so openly carry out wanton violence with no shame, like, we can look back on history and like in the 20th century, the most shameful act is the Holocaust, and even the Nazis knew to like hide their tracks because what they were doing was so evil. We didn't learn about the atrocities of what was happening in the World War II to Jewish people and other targeted groups until the war was over. Whereas like these Antifa people, they do it in the open. They have no shame. So when you have that as like a guiding ethos, like you should be scared of these people in this movement and what they're willing to do. And what they've shown us so far is that they're willing to kill. So
Andy, I think I speak for many of us when I say that you're really an inspiration, and you've inspired me to become more active in journalism and doing what I can to expose what's going on. So with that said, I know you're a busy man, so I really, really want to thank you for coming on.
thank you.
That was Andy Ngo. He is the author of Unmasked, which comes out February 2nd. I got my copy off of Amazon. It's available there. It is a #1 bestseller already. I highly recommend it. Andy is an editor-at-large with the Post Millennial. So once again, I'm completely biased, but I think he does amazing work, despite what some may say. And I think it is important to understand, the last point he made, which is the importance of understanding that what we have is very fragile in our society. And he is doing the work that is very dangerous to his own personal life and safety to expose what is happening. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Let me know what your thoughts are if you're listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Give us a good rating, share with friends and family. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like, please also subscribe. It helps us a lot. I'll make sure to also link the book, the Amazon link, right below in the description if you're on YouTube, so you can pre-order. Again, highly, highly recommend it. Until next time, thank you so much.